What if Alexander the Great's empire never fell? The empire created by Alexander the Great is one of the great what-ifs of history. Alexander the Great created an empire stretching from the Adriatic to Tibet, and it simply collapsed after his death. With Alexander's children too young to fight for their claim to the throne, the empire fell apart to his generals. Each general took their own part of the empire and made their own kingdoms, but none of the generals were talented enough to unite Alexander's old empire, and these kingdoms were slowly picked apart by non-Greeks until there were no Greek kingdoms left in the Middle East. But what if Alexander the Great's empire never fell? What would the borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. What makes the collapse of Alexander the Great's empire even more ironic is that Alexander the Great died at age 32, of either poison or fever induced from heavy drinking, depending on how much you like conspiracy theories. This was right after his spur of conquests in Asia, and so it gave him no time to rebuild the empire. If Alexander the Great had not died then and lived to old age, that would have given him the time to stabilize his empire for a future dynasty. Alexander was not finished his conquests when he died. He felt Zeus had given him all of Asia as his personal territory, and he damn well would get it. The Greeks felt the world was surrounded by a circular ocean surrounding all land, and Alexander's greatest goal was to reach the edge of this circular ocean, which probably corresponds to the Bay of Bengal in the real world. This was such a powerful goal for him that after he invaded India and his troops realized the real size of India, and that it would take them many more years to fulfill Alexander's dream, they mutinied. This angered Alexander so much that he force-marched his troops through some of the harshest deserts in the world on his way back to Persia as punishment. This shows that if Alexander the Great died later, he would have reinvaded India. Since he was one of the greatest generals in history, he would likely have conquered the Nanda Empire of northern India and all the lands to the Bay of Bengal and modern-day Bangladesh. In our timeline, the Mauryans were based out of eastern India, and so Alexander's conquests in this timeline would have rendered the existence of the Mauryan Empire. If you don't already know, the Mauryans were India's initial empire, and they set the precedent for the later Indian empires. But I honestly don't know enough Indian history to talk about the effects of the Mauryan Empire's non-existence in full, but I do know that the Mauryans popularized Buddhism in northern India, and this led to a springboard that allowed Buddhism to enter into East Asia, and so in this timeline, there never would have been Buddhism in countries like Japan, Korea, and China. He probably would not have penetrated south into the Deccan Plateau of central India, since the harsh terrain has prevented many invaders from conquering southern India after the Gangetic Plain. Also, almost all of India's cities and development in this time period were centered around the Gangetic Plain, and South India was pretty unimportant, to be blunt. He also would not have pressed east into Assam or Burma, since the jungle would hurt Alexander's mobile tactics and the lack of development would make conquest difficult. Alexander also showed interest in the civilizations of South Arabia that existed in the Classical Age, because before his death he wanted to send a naval detachment around southern Arabia, and so in this time when he would have conquered the civilizations of South Arabia, but most of Arabia would have remained under Bedouin rule, however, in the deserts. In our timeline, Alexander had massive respect for Persian civilization and culture. He wanted to create a civilization in which Persian culture would mix with Greek culture to create a new hybrid. In our timeline, his general successors disrespected native culture, except for the Ptolemies in Egypt, and this created a divide that destroyed the Hellenistic regimes in the end. Since the Persians and Greeks completely hated each other, it's highly unlikely that the two civilizations would merge in a way that Alexander the Great wanted in our timeline, and so they would likely do what every other empire that has split control between two ethnic minorities that dislike each other. They would split the area geographically under their separate cultural controls. This would be similar to the Austro-Hungarian Empire that had an Austrian West and a Hungarian East, or the Roman Empire that had a Latin West and a Greek East. And so in this timeline, the western part of the Macedonian Empire would be culturally Greek, while the eastern part of the empire would be culturally Persian. During this time period, India was developing a civilization of its own. Caste was developing in northern India. If the region was dominated by Persian culture, at this time of gestation, caste would likely never existed in northern India. This Persian culturally changed north would be differentiated from the purely Indian south. I don't mean to be offensive here, but caste has created a highly conservative Indian society, which has slowed down the implementation of technology and was afraid of change until recently. In this timeline, North India would probably be more technologically advanced. Also, caste was very against the outward colonization from India. This is one of the reasons why India has never colonized another nation. In this timeline, North India may have perhaps colonized Madagascar, Australia, or Indonesia. Historically, India has honestly not had the best military systems. Indians have never launched a major invasion outside of India. Even though I'm not an expert on Indian history, India has seemed to have lost many more wars than it has won. I can't think of a single war which a native Indian population has won against a non-Indian opponent. It has to exist, but since I can't think of it, that shows a historical point. One of the reasons that this happened was that the caste system makes India not able to use its massive population to bear. Indian armies are very similar to Bronze Age armies, in that they have small cohorts of very well-trained troops surrounded by peasant levies. This is because the caste system maintains that only a single caste may be permanent warriors. I know I'm going to get some comments saying Europe had the same thing in the Middle Ages, but European medieval armies were mainly made up of non-noble-born, well-trained men-at-arms who would serve as retainers or in the infantry. In this timeline, the North Indians were able to defeat the nomadic forces that plagued India in our timeline, like the Mughals, Seljuks, and Timurids. This massive empire stretching from the Adriatic to the Bay of Bengal would mean that Jesus would have been born in the Macedonian Empire instead of the Roman. In our timeline, St. Paul, wanting to spread Christianity, traveled to the center of the empire, which is Rome in our timeline, but in this timeline with Babylon as the center of the Macedonian Empire, St. Paul would have gone east. There is the concept of the Axial Age, or the time in between Moses and Muhammad, in which almost all of the world's religions today developed. Buddhism, Confucianism, Christianity, take your pick. The Axial Age happened since the old religions were mainly leftovers from the Bronze Age or Neolithic religions and could not connect with the people of the urbanized Iron Age civilizations. This is why almost the entire world today is covered in religions created in the Axial Age, since they were able to connect with the New World better and trumped the old religions. The Macedonian Empire would have probably converted to Zoroastrianism, since it was already the religion of Persia and an Axial Age religion that would have existed before Christianity, and thus could have kind of had first takes in converting the entire empire. The Zoroastrians in our timeline were violently anti-Christian, and probably would have persecuted Christians and prevented the religion spread throughout the empire. Also, it is much harder for a post-axial age religion to dislodge another post-axial age religion than it is for a post-axial age religion to dislodge a pre-axial age religion. And so, it would be hard for Christianity, a post-axial age religion, to dislodge the other post-axial age religion of Zoroastrianism than it would be for Christianity to dislodge Roman paganism, a pre-axial age belief. And so Christianity never would have caught on in the Macedonian Empire. I wasn't initially going to talk about this, since it's kind of irrelevant to the flow of this alternate history, but I realized there'd be such nerd rage in the comments if I didn't, that I realized I'd have to give it some time. Paris of Epirus was a king in western Greece, and he tried to conquer the young Roman Republic to protect some Greek city-states in southern Italy, and it didn't work. But I was wondering that some people might wonder that the Alexandrian Empire might do a similar thing. But I find it kind of unlikely, because the Alexandrian Empire would have their hands full monitoring their massive empire. It wouldn't really have the excess resources to help their Greek kindred in the West. And also, the Roman Republic was so patriotic and could muster such large armies for its small area that even if they did it and it did work, the Roman Republic could probably just rebel again from their Macedonian overlords when the empire would inevitably have a civil war or some other thing that would weaken the central authority. In the West, the Roman Empire would still develop, but the sheer size of the Macedonian Empire would prevent the Romans from conquering territory from the Macedonians. The Romans would still conquer the territories corresponding to the Western Roman Empire in our timeline, while the Macedonians control the territories corresponding to the Eastern Roman Empire in our timeline. In the 2nd century in our timeline, the Roman Empire was almost destroyed by a combination of civil wars, imperial strife, and barbarian invasions. As the 4th century dawned, however, a series of good emperors were able to re-establish order and keep the empire going for another 100 years plus. However, the western half of the empire was disproportionately affected, and it took resources from the eastern half to help the empire stabilize. Also, Constantine, one of the good emperors, was from Moesia, part of modern-day Romania and Bulgaria, and he would be part of the Macedonian Empire in our timeline. Thus, the Roman Empire in this timeline would probably survive the crisis of the 3rd century, but in a much weaker form. The Roman Empire would likely have collapsed 100 years earlier in this timeline. In our timeline, Constantine made Christianity the state religion since he wanted a religion to unite the disparate cultures of the empire. Yet, if Constantine was from the Macedonian Empire, and if the Roman Empire was in a state of collapse, or was collapsing, during the time when Constantine converted the empire in our timeline, there would be no conversion to Christianity. Without the precedent from our timeline, from the Roman Empire being Christian, the future barbarian kingdoms would have had to decide their own religions without the native populations being Christian. This would mean that each barbarian kingdom would be up in the air about which religion they would choose. I honestly don't know which kingdoms would choose what religion, if they'd be Christian, Roman pagan, Norse pagan, or Mithraic, or any other religion. This makes the future of European history very unpredictable. If I can't predict the religions of this new Europe, it makes predicting the future of these European nations nigh impossible. But there is one thing I can predict, however. Europe would be much more divided. What held the single idea of Europe together was that Europe shared Christianity as a whole. Yet if Europe was religiously divided, this concept of united Europe, different from the rest of the world, would not exist. In our timeline, many of the tribes that brought upon the end of the Roman Empire came from nowhere near the borders of the empire. The Ostrogoths and the Alans were from the Ukraine. The Vandals and Swabians were from Poland. This was because the Hunnic invasion of Europe drove these tribes west into the empire, inevitably destroying it. Yet in this timeline, when the Roman Empire would fall, the Huns would still be somewhere in the stands. Thus, the tribes that would tear down the empire would be different. Tribes like the Franks, Visigoths, and Saxons still would have invaded the empire, but instead of the Vandals, Burgundians, and Swabians, to name a few, we would have seen tribes from the edges of the empire, like the Alemanni or the Cherusci. This would have dramatically altered European history in ways we can't quantify. As much as we don't like to think it, much of European history was changed, or created, by barbarian chieftains in the early Middle Ages. For example, Spain had the Reconquista because the Visigoths ran the state badly and allowed the Muslims to take power. Or France is united because the Franks did a better job of running the state than the Visigoths, Burgundians, etc. Without the Byzantine Empire, there would be no Justinian, and the Alexandrian Empire would be busy on other fronts. We'll get to that soon. But that would mean that there would have been no Byzantine conquest of the Western Mediterranean, and thus this timeline's version of the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy never would have been destroyed, so there never been the power vacuum that led to Italy dividing into small city-states. And so in this timeline, the Italians would be a united kingdom much earlier, like Scotland, France, or England. When Attila the Hun would enter Europe without the Roman Empire, the Huns would have conquered Europe. I know this isn't historically cool to say, but the barbarian tribes had a great respect for the Roman Empire, and so the Roman Empire was able to organize a defense between the tribes against the Huns. Also, without the diplomatic and military genius of the Roman commander Aetius, who fought against the Huns would have won the war. This would actually mean next to nothing. The Hunnic Empire was run almost entirely off Attila's skill and charisma, and with his death the empire would likely collapse like our timeline, similarly to Alexander the Great's empire in our timeline. Attila the Hun would have one major effect, however. He would destroy the Macedonian Balkans. In our timeline, Attila completely obliterated the Roman defenses in the Balkans, and left the region with a power vacuum that eventually led to the seizure by the Bulgars. In this timeline, the same thing would happen, with the Bulgars and the Slavs pouring into the vacuum created in the Macedonian Balkans. Meanwhile, the Macedonian Empire would grow weak from the plague of Justinian, like the Persian and Roman empires in our timeline, as the plague of Justinian killed a third of the population of the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern regions, and they would also have to fight a two-front war against the Slavs in the west and the new Hephthalite nomadic threat in the east. Meanwhile, the Macedonian colonies in southern Arabia would have collapsed in the 2nd century due to climate change making the region desert-like and weakening the monsoon that kept the region alive, similarly to our timeline with the native civilizations that exist before the 2nd century. This would make the empire weak for Arab invasion in the 7th century. Babylon is distressingly close to the Syrian desert, and so only a small striking distance for the Arabian warriors. The Muslim warriors would be successful, since they would be led by some of the greatest generals in history against the weakened empire. India would probably break off from the empire or become conquered by the nomadic Hephthalites. At this point, this alternate history has a lot of unknowns. Would the Macedonians pull back to Greece and create a Byzantine Empire-style state? Are the Arabs able to conquer this versions of the Vandals in North Africa? Or how thoroughly Islamicized will the empire be? These are all very tough questions that, since we're more than 1,000 years from the start of this alternate history, it's hard for me to answer. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching, and please stay tuned for my next alternate history. What if Japan never modernized?